They gathered in secrecy, their voices hushed but dripping with malice, weaving a plot designed to bring you down. Your name passed from one conspirator to the next, their lips curling in satisfaction as they laid the final stones of their deception. They thought they were unseen. They believed their whispers were swallowed by the night. But there are forces that listen beyond human ears, forces that watch where no eyes should see. Just as their schemes reached their climax, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped, the air thickened, and the dim lights trembled as if cowering before an unseen presence. Then, without warning, an otherworldly light sliced through the darkness, turning their shadows into prison bars. Electricity crackled in the air, raising the hairs on their skin. A presence entered the room, so vast, so overwhelming that their knees buckled beneath them. They could not speak, could not think, could not breathe. Then, a voice. Not from a man, not from anything of this world. It was a voice that did not shout but shattered. A voice that did not rage but ruled. It resonated in their bones, in their blood, in the very fabric of their souls. Touch not my anointed one. The weight of those words crushed their confidence into dust. Their grand plans, meticulously crafted, gleefully detailed, became meaningless in an instant. Their breath came in shallow gasps. Their hands trembled, and their mouths tasted the bitterness of fear. Panic seized them. The warehouse that once offered refuge now felt like a trap. They stumbled, collided, clawed for the exit. One by one, they fled into the night, their only thought now survival. There comes a moment when heaven says, enough. For too long, they plotted in secret, mistaking silence for permission. They moved with arrogance, convinced that they controlled the pieces on the board, but what they failed to see was the invisible line they had just crossed, the threshold, where patience ends and divine response begins. Some lines should never be crossed, yet they walked right into one. Heaven had been watching. Every deception, every scheme, every lie they spoke with venomous delight was counted. And with each step they took toward their goal, they unknowingly set themselves up for a reckoning. Their mistake was thinking they were untouchable. They didn't realize that the one they sought to harm was covered, surrounded, and shielded, that their plans, no matter how intricate, were fragile compared to the unseen power moving in the background. They believed they were in control, but in reality, they had just provoked a response they were never prepared for. Because when heaven declares that enough is enough, nothing remains the same. Without warning, the atmosphere shifted. Panic settled in their bones before they could understand why. Their bodies tensed, hands clenched, eyes darted. The confidence they once carried, fueled by deceit, arrogance, and a false sense of power, began to wither. Their mouths, which once spoke wicked plans with ease, now ran dry. And then it hit them. They weren't alone. The very walls seemed to tremble under the weight of the presence that had entered. It wasn't rage, wasn't fury, but something far more terrifying. This was power, raw, undeniable, and beyond anything they had ever encountered. They had been laughing moments ago, certain in their control. But now, laughter was the last thing on their minds. Because the one thing they never expected had just happened. God had entered the room. Then came the voice. It did not thunder, it did not rage, yet it carried the weight of eternity itself. It's time to leave them alone. The words sliced through every excuse, every justification, every last thread of defiance that had held them together. It was not a suggestion, it was not a warning, it was a decree, final, unyielding, absolute. The moment it was spoken, something broke inside them. Their bravado crumbled, their arrogance dissolved. They had been so certain, so convinced that their schemes were untouchable, that no consequence would ever come. But now they saw the truth. This was not fate, this was not karma, this was not some mere coincidence that disrupted their plans. They had provoked something far beyond their comprehension, A force they had mocked now stood before them, rendering them powerless. They wanted to speak, to explain, to beg, but no words came. The weight of the voice pressed against their very souls, silencing their rebellion before it could even take form. There was no argument to be made, no plea to be heard. The judgment had been spoken, and they understood, with bone-deep certainty, this was their final chance to walk away. Because if they didn't, they wouldn't be walking at all. Their confidence did not just fade, it collapsed. The moment. The voice spoke. Something inside them shattered, something buried deep within, the part of the human soul that recognizes true authority when it stands before them. This was not just fear. This was primal terror, the kind that grips the spine, that tightens the chest, that overrides every rational thought with one singular, undeniable truth. They had made a mistake. One of them tried to steady his hands, but they wouldn't stop shaking. Another clenched his jaw to keep his teeth from chattering. Someone took a staggering step back, heart hammering so violently in his chest that he swore it might burst. The bravest among them, the one who had spoken with the most venom against you, tried to swallow, but his throat was as dry as the dust beneath his feet. The air was thick, not just thick but heavy, not like humidity, not like heat, but as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on them, forcing them lower, squeezing the arrogance out of their lungs. They had come here believing they were predators, but now they were prey, cornered, exposed, trembling beneath the weight of something they could not comprehend. And then one of them fell. Not because he was pushed, not because he tripped. He simply collapsed. His legs gave out beneath him, as if his body understood what his mind refused to accept. There was no standing before this power. Another stumbled backward, eyes darting, desperate for an escape. A third reached for the wall, fingers scraping, against concrete, struggling to find something, anything, that could anchor him in the midst of this overwhelming presence. But there was no escape, no exit sign, no whispered plan, no amount of logic could break the grip of what was happening. They had spent weeks, months, maybe even years crafting this plan, perfecting every detail, believing they were in complete control. They had laughed as they spoke your name, as if you were nothing more than an obstacle, a footnote in their grand design. Now, laughter was impossible. Now, speech itself was a battle. Their bodies betrayed them, their voices failed them, and all that remained was the weight of knowing. They had thought this was a game. They had thought their cleverness would carry them through, that their whispers in the dark would remain unheard, unseen. They had been so sure that there would be no consequence. And yet, here it was, staring them in the face, crushing them beneath its presence, unraveling them piece by piece. One of them, the youngest, the most reckless, tried to reason through the terror, tried to rationalize what was happening. This isn't real, he wanted to say. This is just our imagination. But no words came. Because reality doesn't need belief to exist. And what they faced in that moment was the most real thing they had ever encountered. No more whispered plans, no more certainty, no more illusion of power, just silence, wide-eyed terror. And the undeniable truth that they had stepped into a war they were never meant to fight. They had made a fatal miscalculation. This battle was never theirs, and now they were paying the price. There was no escaping this, no undoing what had been set in motion. They had stepped too far, crossed a line they didn't even know existed, and now the cost of their actions had been determined. Some wars aren't worth waging, and this one had already been lost. Their minds raced, desperate to understand what came next. Would they be struck down where they stood? Would they lose everything overnight? Would their names be erased, their legacies turned to dust? The unknown stretched before them like an abyss, and for the first time they were afraid to take another step. One of them, the boldest among them, opened his mouth, perhaps to plead, perhaps to deny, but nothing came out. His voice had been stolen, his words made meaningless in the presence of the one who spoke the final word. Then it happened. A glimpse. It wasn't a vision, not in the way one sees with their eyes. No, this was something deeper, something undeniable. They saw what awaited them if they continued. They saw the ruin, the loss, the destruction. They saw themselves walking a path that led only to desolation, their own lives crumbling beneath the weight of a force they could never hope to withstand. This wasn't just a warning. It was a sentence, already written, waiting only for their final decision. Stay and face it. Or run and hope they were still allowed to escape. Their hands shook, their legs felt weak, their minds screamed for them to move. And then, one by one, without speaking, they turned. Because in that moment, they learned a painful truth. When you mess with the chosen, you answer to the Creator. Stop right there. Yes, you. This message isn't for everyone, and if you don't feel it, that's fine. Move along. But if you felt it, deep in your bones, you'll know this is for you. The ones who don't fit in, the ones who see beyond the veil, the ones who've been told to stay quiet, to settle, to conform, but never could. They aren't interested in what's ordinary. They aren't here to follow someone else's rules. They're the light in the dark, the storm that shatters illusions, the unshakable, the unstoppable, the untouchable. While the world is busy running circles, they're walking their own path, alone if they must. Not for the applause, not for the approval, but because it's who they are. Here's to the ones who take what was meant to destroy them and transform it into something divine. The ones who carry wisdom that can't be taught, only earned. If this resonates with you, then maybe it's time to find your people. The Obsidian Inner Order is the only place of its kind, the #1 ascension nexus for chosen ones, where over 400 of us gather to share wisdom, connect and transform. No masks, no games, just truth. The link is in the description. If you're ready, you'll know where to find us. If not, that's fine too. The choice is yours. One by one they bolted, stumbling over each other in their desperate bid to escape the presence that had invaded their space. Their carefully laid out plans, their smug certainty, their whispered confidence, all of it shattered under the weight of something far greater than they had ever encountered. Some ran blindly into the night, their only thought to put as much distance between themselves and that warehouse as possible. Others clutched at their chests, gasping for air, feeling as if unseen hands still pressed against their lungs. One fell to his knees, paralyzed by what he had just witnessed, his mind unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had taken place. They didn't stop to question it. They didn't dare look back, because whatever had stood in that room with them was not meant to be challenged, not meant to be defied. And the further they ran, the more they understood. This was not just about a failed plan. This was a warning. Some whispered prayers under their breath, words they hadn't spoken in years, pleading for mercy they weren't sure they would receive. Others refused to acknowledge what had happened, convincing themselves that it was just fear, just paranoia. But deep down, they all knew the truth. They had stepped into something beyond their understanding. And worse, they had been allowed to walk away, not because they were strong, but because they had been spared. The night swallowed them, but the memory remained. And not one of them would ever forget the moment they realized, you are untouchable. The world outside moved on, but they didn't. Not really. They went back to their routines, tried to reclaim their sense of normalcy, but something had shifted. Something had broken. The events of that night clung to them like a stain, a shadow, that wouldn't fade, no matter how much they tried to wash it away with denial. Sleep became their enemy. Every time they closed their eyes, it was there, the suffocating stillness of the warehouse, the sudden shift in the air, the moment when laughter turned to terror. The voice echoed in their dreams, its weight pressing into their souls like an iron brand. Touch not my anointed one. Some woke up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. Others lay motionless in bed, staring at the ceiling, afraid to surrender to sleep, knowing what waited for them on the other side. Even in the daylight, the memory lingered. Shadows in the corners of rooms felt deeper than before, like something unseen watched them, not out of malice, but as a reminder, a constant, unspoken warning. They avoided each other. The ones who had once plotted together, whispered in hushed voices, shared in their twisted ambition. Now they barely exchanged glances. If they crossed paths, it was brief. No words, no acknowledgement, just a silent understanding. We were there. We saw. We know. Some tried to drown it out. Loud music, endless distractions, mindless indulgence in anything that could numb the unease. But silence was their enemy now, because in the quiet, their minds always wandered back to that moment. The raw power, the paralyzing fear, the undeniable truth. One of them, the boldest before that night, sat in his office and stared at his hands. They still trembled. He clenched them into fists, willing the weakness away. But deep down he knew this wasn't something he could shake off. Another found himself praying, though he had never believed before. He didn't know who he was praying to, didn't even know what to say. He only knew that if what they had faced that night was real, then everything he had built, his life on, was a lie. None of them could explain it. They couldn't call it a hallucination. They couldn't pass it off as paranoia. Because they all felt it, they all heard it, and what's worse, they all knew it hadn't even been the full measure of what could have happened. They had been allowed to leave. Allowed. Not because they were strong, not because they had outsmarted anything, but because something had let them go. That truth sat in their stomachs like lead. It gnawed at the back of their minds, whispering that the mercy they had been shown that night might not be extended again. So they never spoke of it. Not to each other, not to anyone, but in the quiet moments when they were alone with their thoughts, the fear remained. And though they would never say it out loud, they all knew one thing with terrifying certainty. The moment God stepped in, they lost. And whatever they had planned before, they would never dare try again. You never lifted a finger. Yet you were defended by forces unseen, surrounded by an invisible shield that no scheme, no strategy, no whispered plot could ever break. While they spent their nights conspiring, heaven had already moved. Before they even spoke your name in secret, a response had been set in motion. They thought they were hunting you, but in reality, they were walking straight into a wall of divine protection. Forces beyond their understanding had always been standing guard, watching, waiting, ensuring that no weapon formed against you would ever prosper. Their arrogance blinded them to this truth. They mistook the silence of heaven for absence, not realizing that silence is sometimes just the stillness before divine intervention. But now they knew. Because when the moment came, when their plans reached their peak, they weren't met with resistance from you. They were met with resistance from him. The fear they felt wasn't because they had been caught, it was because they had been seen. Every hidden conversation, every move made in darkness, every seed of deception they had planted was laid bare under an exposing light. They had convinced themselves that their battle was with you, but they had unknowingly waged war against something infinitely greater. You were never alone. You never had to fight, because the chosen ones don't move unguarded. There are angels that encamp around them, shielding them from harm, standing in the gaps they don't even know exist. Heaven fights battles that the chosen never even hear about, dismantling plots before they take form, silencing threats before they gain strength. This is the power of divine protection, and no plot, no scheme, no enemy, no force, whether in the physical or the unseen, can override it. They had tried, they had failed, and now they carried the weight of that truth in their bones. What they intended for harm, God used for elevation. They conspired, strategized, and waited for the moment of your downfall, certain that their plans would succeed. They imagined the sight of you broken, diminished, removed from your place of favor. In their minds, they had already won. But what they failed to understand was a fundamental, unshakable truth. No attack against the chosen can override divine purpose. If you weren't a threat, they wouldn't have come for you in the first place. Think about it. No one plots against the powerless. No one conspires against the insignificant. The very fact that they worked so hard to bring you down is proof that you carry something they fear, a destiny that cannot be stopped. They believed they could control the outcome. They assumed their deception would be enough, that their manipulation would turn others against you, that their betrayal would weaken you, but instead, they only accelerated what was already set in motion. They wanted to delay you, but in their attempt to block your path, they unknowingly pushed you forward. They tried to silence you, but in their effort to quiet your voice, they only made you more powerful. They sought to break you, but instead, they revealed something they never expected. You are unbreakable. This is the irony of attacking the chosen. Every attempt to destroy them becomes a tool for their elevation. It has always worked this way. The more the opposition rises, the more the chosen ascend. The more enemies try to suffocate their purpose, the greater their reach becomes. History has proven it time and time again. What was meant for destruction is transformed into elevation. Because divine favor cannot be revoked. It cannot be stolen, transferred, or cancelled. When heaven has placed something upon your life, no human hand can remove it. They thought they had power over your destiny, but their schemes were nothing more than whispers in the wind. You were never in danger. They were. Because the moment they moved against you, they set themselves against something far greater. And now, as they reel from the consequences of their actions, you step forward, not as a victim of their schemes, but as one who has been lifted beyond their reach. You walk unshaken, you move unstoppable, and they who once thought they held control can do nothing but watch. Walk boldly, you are backed by heaven. Let them plot, let them whisper, let them scheme in darkness, convinced that their actions will go unseen. It changes nothing. You are not alone. You have never been alone. Every step you take, every battle you face, every enemy that rises against you, divine protection moves before you, beside you, behind you. You do not have to fight battles that were never yours to begin with. When they rise against you, they are not rising against just a person. They are rising against the one who called you, the one who anointed you, the one who defends you. That is why they fail. That is why they scatter. That is why, in the end, you remain standing while they are left in ruins. Never fear what is plotted in the dark. Light always exposes. Justice always prevails. Keep walking. Keep standing. Keep moving forward, unshaken and unstoppable. Let the world learn this truth. The chosen ones are not to be touched. No weapon formed against you shall prosper.